Snow swept down the mountains in thick, twisting veils, hissing across the asphalt like whispers from the dark. Officer Mark Evans had driven this stretch of Evergreen's back road more times than he could count. But tonight, the wind seemed intent on pushing him off it. Beside him, Shadow sat upright in the passenger seat, his breath fogging the window, ears sharp as antennae. The headlights caught something. Movement. A small, thin figure staggered along the shoulder, cradling an even smaller bundle against his chest. Mark's grip tightened on the wheel. Before the thought fully formed, Shadow let out a low, urgent whine, his body angling toward the door. Mark eased the cruiser to the side, snow crunching under the tires. "Easy," Mark murmured, opening the door. The cold slapped him instantly, slicing through his uniform. The boy couldn't have been older than 12, his hair plastered to his forehead in frozen clumps. His lips moved, but the wind swallowed the sound. Only when Mark drew closer did he catch it. A whisper carried on the storm. "They don't want us anymore." The words cut through him, not with volume, but with the weight they carried, like something already broken being dropped again. The child in his arms was a girl, maybe 3, her cheeks chalky white under the dim glow of the cruiser lights. Her tiny hands hung limp. "You're safe now," Mark said, though he knew the boy might not believe it yet. He pulled a thermal blanket from the trunk and wrapped it snugly around the girl, tucking her close to his chest for warmth. Shadow moved in, pressing his solid frame against the boy's legs, radiating heat through the thin, damp denim. The boy's eyes flickered, hesitation giving way to the smallest shift toward the dog. Mark scanned the ridge and tree line. Nothing but snow and shadow. Still, something in the boy's voice told him the danger wasn't gone. "What's your name?" Mark asked. The boy hesitated. "Noah." His voice cracked like it hadn't been used much. "And hers?" "Lily." He adjusted his grip, shielding her face from the wind. Up close, Mark saw more. Dark hollows beneath Noah's eyes, ribs faintly visible where his jacket gaped. They weren't just cold. They were worn down. "Where's home, Noah?" The boy's gaze shifted past Mark, over the road, into the black curtain of forest. "Not there. Can't go back." Mark didn't press, not yet. He knew the look in Noah's eyes, the one that measured trust like a scarce resource. "We're going to the station," Mark said. "There's heat, food." He caught the boy's almost imperceptible flinch at the word station, so he added, "And Shadow will be there the whole time." Noah's gaze went to the German shepherd again, lingering longer this time. Shadow didn't blink, didn't move, just waited. Mark opened the back door, easing Noah and Lily inside. He draped another blanket over them, cranked the heat, and steered back toward town. Snow beat against the windshield, each flake a pale dart in the dark. Mark's mind ticked over questions. How long had they been out here? Where they'd come from? And what kind of place made a boy say something like, "They don't want us anymore"? In the rearview mirror, he saw Noah's head lean slightly toward Shadow, the boy's thin fingers curling into the dog's fur. It wasn't much, but it was the first step toward something resembling safety. As Evergreen's faint lights emerged in the distance, Mark knew one thing for certain. He wasn't letting these kids go back, no matter what waited on the other side of that frozen road. The warmth of the station hit like a tide when Mark shouldered through the door, but it didn't melt the tension wrapped around the boy. Noah stayed stiff in the chair the medics guided him to, eyes darting from corner to corner, as though expecting someone to follow him inside. Lily, swaddled in layers of blankets, gave a faint shiver but made no sound. Shadow stationed himself at Noah's side, his body angled between the boy and the rest of the room. Every time a medic leaned in to check Lily's pulse or brush snow from her hair, Noah's gaze went sharp, but Shadow's steady presence seemed to hold him in place. The dog's ears tilted toward each sound, but his body stayed calm, as if saying to the boy, "I'm here, you're not alone." Mark stayed a step back, letting the medics work. He knew better than to force conversation when a kid's trust was hanging by a single thread. When he did approach, it was with slow, deliberate movements, his badge glinting under the fluorescent light. "Noah," he said quietly, crouching to meet the boy's eyes. "You and Lily are safe here. No one's going to hurt you." The boy didn't answer, but his hand slid, almost unconsciously, into the thick fur at Shadow's neck. The first crack in the silence came minutes later. One of the medics offered Noah a cup of hot chocolate, steam curling above the rim. He didn't drink it at first, just stared at the rising wisps like they were carrying him somewhere far away. Then, softly, almost like it wasn't meant for anyone to hear, he said, "There was a yellow house once, a lady who smelled like cookies." Mark's mind locked on the detail. A yellow house, a woman, cookies. The way he said it wasn't casual, it was the kind of memory someone keeps hidden, like a candle in the dark. Before Mark could ask more, a flicker on the wall monitor caught his attention. One of the dispatchers had pulled up the exterior security feed, grainy footage of snow falling outside the station. There in the swirling white stood a man, tall, broad-shouldered, posture coiled with intent. His head moved slowly, scanning the windows, lingering too long on each. The falling snow softened his edges, but it didn't hide the predatory way he shifted his weight. Mark felt the shift in the room before the sound came. Shadow's low growl, deep and steady, like a warning rolling up from the earth. Noah stiffened, his hand tightening in the dog's fur. "Lock the back entrance," Mark said to the nearest officer without taking his eyes off the screen. The man outside didn't move closer, but his presence clung to the glass like frost. Mark's mind ran through possibilities. Whoever this was, he wasn't here by chance. The station was no random stop in the storm. He was looking for something, or someone. Noah's gaze had gone fixed on the monitor. His breathing shallow, Mark knelt again, lowering his voice. "Do you know him?" The boy's answer came only as a slight shake of the head. But it wasn't the movement of someone unsure. It was the careful denial of someone who knew exactly what telling the truth might cost. Snow blurred the image on the monitor, but the man lingered another full minute before melting into the dark, swallowed by the storm. The silence he left behind felt heavier than his presence. Mark turned to Noah. "You don't have to talk about him now, but I need you to know, if he comes back, we'll be ready." Noah's eyes flicked from Mark to Shadow. The dog, still watchful, shifted closer, pressing his shoulder into the boy's knee. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was a start. Outside, the snow kept falling, hiding and revealing in the same breath. Inside, Mark knew the night had just gotten more complicated. The man in the snow was gone for now, but his shadow had settled over the room, and it wouldn't be leaving any time soon. By morning, the snow had thinned to a slow drift, each flake falling like it had nowhere urgent to be. Mark stood by the wide front windows of the station, coffee cooling in his hand, watching the pale light push against the shadows of the pines. The man from last night had vanished into those same trees, and the absence felt more dangerous than his presence. The door creaked open, bringing a slice of cold air with it. Special Agent Claire Monroe stepped inside, brushing snow from her coat. She was tall, composed, with a way of carrying herself that made people think twice before wasting her time. Her eyes, sharp and steady, took in the scene. Noah hunched at a table, Shadow at his side, Lily still asleep under a mound of blankets in the break room. "Morning, Mark," she said, lowering her voice. "Got your message. Tell me about the boy." Mark gave her the short version, how they'd found Noah and Lily on the mountain road, the whisper about not being wanted, the stranger outside. Claire's expression barely shifted, but he could tell she was filing every word away. When she approached Noah, she didn't go straight for questions. Instead, she crouched a few feet away, letting him keep the table between them. "I'm Claire," she said. "I help people figure out where they belong." Noah didn't answer, just kept tracing his fingertip along the grain of the wood. Shadow's head followed Claire's movements, but his tail gave a single, slow wag, as if signaling that she was all right. For now. Claire tried a different approach. "You know, sometimes people get lost for a long time, and sometimes they get found, even if it's been years." Noah's eyes flicked up for the briefest second before dropping again. It wasn't much, but Mark noticed it. After a few minutes, Claire stepped back and joined Mark in the hallway. 7 years ago," she said quietly, "a boy named Evan Holloway was reported missing by his grandmother, Margaret Holloway. He would have been about Noah's age now. Never found." Mark's brow furrowed. "You think this is him?" "I think it's possible. The age matches. So does the timing. And the look in his eyes. That's a kid who's had to survive more than he should." Mark's gaze slid back to the table. Noah was leaning into Shadow now, fingers buried in the dog's fur. The boy's shoulders rose and fell in slow, measured breaths, like Shadow's presence was the only steady thing in the room. It hit Mark harder than he expected. His thoughts drifted, unbidden, to Mia, his own daughter, back in the hospital again. The image of her small frame curled against white sheets was never far from his mind. He knew the weight of fighting for someone's safety, of feeling powerless in the face of forces that didn't care. When he returned to the table, he didn't ask Noah about the man in the snow or the yellow house. Instead, he set a small box in front of him, a battered tin of dog treats. "These are Shadow's favorite," Mark said. "You can give him one if you want." For a moment, Noah didn't move. Then, slowly, he reached into the tin, pulled out a biscuit, and held it out. Shadow took it gently, his tail wagging once before he dropped a worn tennis ball onto the boy's lap. The smallest flicker of a smile ghosted across Noah's face, there and gone in less than a second. But Mark saw it, and Claire, watching from the doorway, saw it too. Outside, the pines stood silent under their quilt of snow, holding their secrets. Somewhere among them, a man was waiting, and Mark knew they were only at the beginning of finding out what he wanted, and what he'd already done. But for now, in this moment, there was a boy, a dog, and the faintest thread of trust beginning to form. And that, Mark thought, was worth protecting with everything he had. The morning light filtered into the station in long, pale ribbons, dust motes drifting lazily in their glow. Outside, the snow had crusted over, sparkling under the weak sun. Inside, the air was still, the kind of quiet that feels like it's holding its breath. Mark sat across from Noah at a low table, a steaming mug between them. Noah's eyes stayed on the surface of the cocoa, but his fingers drummed softly against the wood. Shadow lay at his side, head resting on the boy's shoe. "Noah," Mark said gently, sliding a pad of paper and a set of colored pencils toward him. "Sometimes it's easier to show than to tell. Can you draw me a place you remember? Somewhere that mattered?" For a long moment, Nothing. Then Noah's small hand reached out, choosing a dull green pencil. Slowly, he began to sketch. Lines bent into winding trees, their roots curling around each other like knotted rope. A narrow river bent sharply near the bottom of the page. Above it, in uneven letters, he wrote 2 words: "Only wind." Mark studied it. The trees were dense, the riverbank steep. The words hung there like a riddle. "What does that mean?" he asked softly. Noah shrugged, his lips pressing together. His gaze flickered toward the window, where the pines swayed in the distance. Claire stepped closer, her eyes narrowing as she took in the map. "I've heard stories," she said almost to herself, "about a man in the national forest. Keeps to himself, but folks call him the warden. No one really knows where he lives. Could be this." She tapped the river bend with her finger. Mark caught something else. Shadow had lifted his head, eyes locked on the drawing, tail giving a single, deliberate thump. Then, without command, he stood and padded toward the front door, glancing back at Mark as if to say, "We've been near there before." Noah's gaze followed the dog, and for the first time, there was no fear in it, only a cautious kind of interest. Shadow, sensing the shift, returned to him and dropped a scuffed yellow tennis ball at his feet. The boy blinked, as if surprised by the offering. After a beat, he picked it up and tossed it a few feet away. Shadow retrieved it instantly, his movements unhurried but sure. Mark let the moment sit. Building trust with a kid like Noah wasn't about big gestures. It was about collecting these tiny, quiet moments until they meant something. Still, the drawing gnawed at him. The bend in the river, the dense trees, the strange phrase, "only wind." He'd been in Evergreen long enough to know the forest held more than just deer and campers. Some places felt wrong without any clear reason why. When Claire stepped out to make a call, Mark leaned in, keeping his tone easy. "Did you ever hear the wind there? Was it loud?" Noah's pencil paused. His voice was a near whisper. It was the only thing that talked. Mark didn't push further. Whatever this warden place was, it had shaped Noah in ways that wouldn't be undone quickly. But the fact that he'd drawn it at all, that he'd let them see, was progress. The rest of the morning passed in slow, deliberate steps. Lily woke, clinging to a stuffed bear one of the officers had found in storage. Noah stayed close to her, but every so often, his hand would drop to rest on Shadow's back, grounding himself. Mark tucked the drawing into a folder before heading into his office. The map wasn't just a child's sketch. It was a breadcrumb. And in the snow-covered silence of Evergreen, breadcrumbs could lead to the kind of places you prayed didn't exist. For now, though, they had daylight, a boy who was beginning to trust, and a German shepherd whose instincts had never steered him wrong. The forest would still be there tomorrow, and when they went, they'd be ready. The forest greeted them with a cold that felt older than the snow. It wasn't just the bite of the wind. It was the stillness, the way the towering pines closed in and blotted out the sun. Their boots sank into the crusted drifts with muffled crunches, each step swallowed by the quiet. Mark led the way, Claire close behind, the SWAT team fanned out in careful formation. Noah's hand-drawn map was tucked into Mark's vest pocket, its river bend and looping trees etched into his mind. Shadow trotted ahead, nose low, his breath puffing out in sharp bursts. The further they moved in, the sharper the air became, clean, but with a sterile undercurrent that didn't belong here. Mark knew that smell. It was bleach, faint but insistent, threading through the scent of sap and frost. Claire caught it too. "That's not from the storm," she murmured. Shadow stopped abruptly, ears pointed like arrows. His tail went rigid, body coiled with focus. Mark halted the team with a raised fist. "Hold," he whispered. The dog took 3 deliberate steps forward, then veered to the right. His paw brushed against something almost invisible, a thin wire strung knee-high between 2 trees. Mark's stomach dropped. "Tripwire," he said. One of the SWAT officers crouched, tracing the wire to a small, rust-flecked canister buried under snow. The label was long gone, but the shape told them enough. It wasn't meant to welcome visitors. The officer worked quickly, hands precise, disarming the device with a quiet click. Mark exhaled only when the wire sagged harmlessly against the snow. "This isn't a hunter's setup," Claire said. "Whoever lives here, they want to know exactly when someone's coming." The team pressed on, their pace slower now, scanning the undergrowth for more traps. The trees thickened, bending toward each other until the sky was no more than a thin seam overhead. Another 50 yards in, they found a second tripwire, this one connected to a crude alarm of tin cans strung high between branches. And beyond that, faint in the distance, the outline of a cabin appeared through the weave of the pines. It wasn't much to look at. A squat, weathered structure with warped siding and a chimney coughing out a thin ribbon of smoke. But even from here, Mark felt the wrongness radiating from it. The bleach scent was stronger now, curling through the cold air like a warning. Shadow stood perfectly still, watching the cabin with unblinking eyes. His nose twitched, and a low rumble formed in his chest. Mark gave a small nod to Claire, then to the team. 2 units flank, we approach center, eyes sharp. They moved in tight formation. The snow muffled everything but the crunch of boots and the slow creak of their gear. Somewhere ahead, a shutter banged once, the sound brittle in the cold. Mark's gaze flicked to the cabin's windows, covered in thick plastic instead of glass, warped and clouded. No clear view inside. The front steps groaned under his weight as he approached the door. Shadow was at his side now, tail low but steady, muscles tense. Mark reached for the handle, unlocked, and pushed it open slowly. The first breath of air that escaped the cabin was heavy, stale. It smelled of dust, old smoke, and something else underneath. Something that made the hair rise on the back of his neck. He glanced back at Claire, then stepped inside. The floorboards moaned underfoot, the dim light revealing peeling wallpaper and a clutter of mismatched furniture. And then, from somewhere beneath them, came the faint, wet sound of a cough. Shadow's head snapped toward the corner of the room, ears pricked. His paw scratched once at the floor, then again, more urgently. Mark followed the motion and saw it. A rug, just slightly out of place. The tension in the room ratcheted tighter. Whatever was down there, they were close now. And Mark had the sinking certainty that this cabin was just the surface of something far darker. The rug was the color of old tea, frayed at the corners and heavy with dust. Mark knelt, slid his fingers under the edge and lifted. A square of dark wood stared back, a recessed handle stamped into it, the edges rubbed smooth by years of hands. Shadow lowered his head to the seam and drew in a breath, body settling into a patient, vibrating stillness that meant certainty. Mark glanced at Claire, a small nod. The SWAT lead eased forward, set a wedge, and lifted. The hinges answered with a soft, tired sigh, and a cool breath of air rose from below, earthy, still, layered with the scent of pine and something medicinal that tried and failed to smell clean. The stairwell yawned open, narrow, steep, planked with old timbers that creaked even before anyone stepped on them. Mark clicked on his light, then stopped. A sound floated up, thin as paper, the gentlest cough. Then another, the kind of cough a child tries to swallow so it won't be heard. Shadow stepped onto the first tread and waited, head angled back to Mark like a question. Mark moved beside him, boots testing each step, one hand on the wall, the other guiding the beam. The light found rings of moisture staining the wood, nail heads winking like dull stars, and at the bottom, another door, not fully closed. He pushed it open with the back of his knuckles. The room was the size of a one-car garage, low ceiling, walls paneled in plainboard. It looked halfway between storage and a forgotten bedroom, neat in places, improvised in others. Blankets folded on crates, a plastic bin of crayons and blunt pencils, a string of paper snowflakes taped along one wall, their edges curled. In the far corner, 3 children huddled together, eyes wide, shoulders pressed so close they seemed sewn. No one screamed, no one moved. Only the smallest hand, the middle child, rose and settled again on the youngest one's back in a rhythm that was more instinct than thought. Shadow went still. His ears softened, tail low, not wagging, not stiff, just present. Mark felt the dog's restraint like a hand on his own shoulder. Steady, guiding. "Hey," Mark said, and then stopped himself. He kept his voice warm but thin, less a word than a temperature. He lowered his beam so it brushed the floor, not their faces. He slipped his badge from his vest and set it on the nearest crate where small eyes could find it without feeling chased by it. A girl about 6, smudges of green crayon on her fingers, shifted first. She had the gravity of a person who had learned to be older than her years, and she kept one arm wrapped around the smallest boy like a seatbelt. Her gaze moved from Mark to Shadow, then to Mark again. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The question was all there. Mark eased a step forward and crouched, putting himself where he could see the floorboards, not just their faces. He tugged a blanket from the crate, shook it once, and laid it out midway between them and him, like setting a small bridge and stepping back from it. Claire arrived at his shoulder, took in the room without letting her eyes snag on any one thing too long. "We have coats," she murmured, barely air. The SWAT lad stayed at the doorway, body small as he could make it, rifle angled to the floor, presence more promise than threat. The youngest boy coughed again, quick, apologetic. The older girl tightened her hold, then carefully shifted him toward the blanket Mark had spread. She never let go of him completely. It was a practiced motion, gentle and sure, like she had done the same thing in places colder than this. Shadow lowered himself until his belly found the floor. He rested his chin on his paws and blinked slow, the way dogs do when they want a room to borrow their calm. The girl's eyes drifted to him and held there, her shoulders unhooked by degrees you could count if you had the patience. "Her name," Claire whispered, more to Mark than the children, and then stopped. The girl must have read something kind in Claire's face, because she touched her chest with 2 fingers and tapped twice, as if answering a roll call only she could hear. "Daisy," Mark said, testing the name on a soft exhale. The girl's head tilted, surprised to be known. The smallest boy burrowed closer. Daisy adjusted her grip, humming under her breath. Not a melody, a steady line you could walk along. Above them, a floorboard popped. The house breathed. Snow brushed the plastic that covered a distant window. The sounds came through the wood like old neighbors, familiar, predictable. The room listened and found no alarms in them. Mark radioed upstairs. 3 children, conscious, responsive. Bring the med kit. No sirens, slow steps. He kept his voice level, the type of level that reminded adults to be gentle because kids were watching. The reply came back, just as quiet. "Help is coming. We see you." When the medic appeared at the top of the stairs, Mark lifted 2 fingers. "Stop." He gestured open palm, then down. Soft feet, slow air. The medic descended the first steps like a librarian descending into a reading room. He set the kit near the blanket, unlatched it, and slid out a small bottle of water and a finger pulse ox like he was laying out crayons. Daisy watched everything. She didn't reach for the water until she saw the medic take a sip himself. Small, respectful, more demonstration than drink. Then she guided the bottle to the youngest boy's lips and counted his swallows, patient as a nurse. Footfalls scraped above. Another thread of sound, lighter, quicker. Noah. Mark didn't have to turn to know the pace. The boy arrived in the doorway with Shadow's tennis ball held like a talisman. He froze at the sight of the children, the room, the paper snowflakes. His throat moved once. He looked to Shadow and then to Mark. 2 lighthouses, 1 shore. Shadow shifted his head. A nod in dog language. Noah crossed the last steps and knelt at the edge of the blanket. He didn't speak. He held out the ball. Daisy studied it as if it were an object from a language she hadn't heard in a while. Then, carefully, she reached, took it, and rolled it back into Noah's palm. A closed loop. "Hello." The smallest boy's cough softened. The oldest child, maybe 9, finally lifted his chin. He had the watchful eyes of a sentry and the posture of someone who had learned to anticipate doors. He glanced at the stairwell, then at the wall where the paper snowflakes marched. His chest eased when he realized that the footsteps above had changed their shape. Different weight, different cadence. Safety has a rhythm, and he was hearing it. Claire's radio chirped once, muted. She turned her head, listened, then met Mark's eyes. Perimeter secure, no movement outside. The cabin, for now, was a closed book. "Let's bring them up," Mark said, barely louder than the hum of Daisy's tune. He didn't reach for anyone. He stood and stepped back, creating a path, then waited. Daisy moved first. She rose, gathered the youngest boy to her hip the way older sisters do when they've practiced in the dark. Her hand hovered over Lily. Lily, wrapped in a station blanket, cheeks flushed now, carried by a second medic who'd come to help. Daisy's expression tilted, half wonder, half relief, like the universe had arranged its puzzle pieces, and they finally fit. They climbed the stairs in an odd, careful procession. The oldest child kept pace just behind Daisy, eyes flicking up and down, mapping each rung like he intended to remember it for later. Mark brought up the rear. Shadow took the middle, flank to flank, checking, listening, absorbing the room's fear and returning something steadier. At the top, the cabin's stale light felt warmer than before, like the simple act of bringing people into it had changed its temperature. The med team moved with deliberate kindness. Coats open like wings, blankets offered like invitations. No bustling, no clatter. Daisy looked around, then made a choice that said more than any sentence could. She guided the smallest boy toward Shadow and placed his hand on the dog's shoulder. The boy's fingers sank into the thick fur. He exhaled, a small balloon losing just enough air to float at eye level. Mark took in the room, the peeled wallpaper, the quiet tables, the life that had been arranged down below to look like something other than waiting. He felt the shape of the next hours forming. Vitals and cocoa, names given and written down. A drive that would feel longer than the map said it was, and a station that would be warmer than it had ever been. He looked at Claire. She had already lifted her gaze past the walls and into the trees, thoughts threading toward warrants and search grids, timelines and names. But when she glanced back, there was a softness at the edges of her focus. She'd seen Daisy's hand on Lily. She'd heard the hum. "One step at a time," Mark said. Claire nodded. "One step." Outside, the wind mused through the pines. Not harsh now, just present. Inside, the room held a new kind of quiet, the kind that follows a held breath, the kind that means the next breath can be deeper. Shadow stood, shook once, and looked up at Mark. The dog's eyes carried a message as clear as speech. "We found them." Mark answered without words. His hand found the back of Shadow's neck. A pressure, a promise. Then he turned toward the door and the white afternoon beyond it, ready to carry the children into the light. The cabin settled into a hush so complete you could hear jacket zippers whisper. Medics moved like librarians. Daisy kept one palm on the smallest boy's shoulder. Lily dozed against a blanket-warmed chest. Mark stood near the door, scanning the timberline through the plastic-covered window while Claire coordinated the exit. 2 vehicles, staggered departure, no sirens, clean lines. A small sound, more felt than heard, threaded up from the stairwell. Shadow's head lifted. His ears tuned, then tilted. Mark caught the signal. The dog had read the air. "Hold," Mark breathed. The board at the top of the cellar stairs nudged. A fraction. The rug shifted. Then the hatch pushed wider, and a figure rose into the frame. Broad shoulders filling the space, a knit cap tugged low, eyes taking stock. In one gloved hand, a short wooden club hung loose, more show than swing, but enough to turn the room electric. Time thinned. "Evergreen Police," Mark said, voice steady, palms visible. "Set it down, we're done here." The man's gaze flicked over faces, Claire, the medics, the kids, landing a beat too long on Noah. That was the seam. Noah felt it and moved a half step back until his calf met Shadow's shoulder. His fingers found the dog's collar and held, small knuckles white against leather, like anchoring to a dock while the tide shifted underfoot. The club lifted an inch. Not a strike, a test. Shadow rose without a sound, weight forward, not a leap, not a bark, just the coiled certainty of a trained partner reaching a line. Mark didn't need a hand signal. Shadow already had his. "Set it down," Mark repeated, softer. "This ends with everyone walking out." The man's jaw tightened. The club tipped. Shadow moved. It was clean and quick. One decisive burst, a shoulder bump that wasn't a bite or a blow, just a precise, practiced nudge that redirected the wrist. Wood clattered harmlessly across the floorboards, skittering into a corner. Shadow planted, body between the man and the children, eyes up, still as a statue that could breathe. SWAT flowed in like a tide through a narrow channel. 2 officers from the side window, 1 from the rear door, calm, contained, hands and voices working in the same key. "Hands," one said. "Now." The man hesitated, then lifted them. Plastic cuffs clicked. No struggle, no clatter, just the air letting itself out after being held too long. Claire stepped in front of the cellar hatch and sealed it with her presence, careful and clear. "You're detained," she said simply. "You'll be treated safely." She had a way of making the word safely land like a rule the room had to follow. Mark exhaled. The temperature of the cabin seemed to shift, the stale smell giving way to the honest cold of winter air sneaking through the doorframe. He kept his focus on the kids, not the cuffs. "We're leaving," he told the room, and it wasn't an order. It was a release. Noah didn't look at the man. He was watching Shadow, just Shadow, his grip still firm on the collar. The dog leaned a fraction into him, not enough to push, just enough to say, I feel you there." Noah's chest rose and fell, a new rhythm, shaky on the edges, steadying at the center. Daisy's eyes had gone wide when the hatch opened, then steady when it closed again on a different future. She adjusted the smallest boy on her hip and scanned the floor, found Shadow's scuffed tennis ball, and tucked it into her coat pocket like a promise for later. The medics resumed their quiet choreography. Vitals checked, blankets secured. One officer slipped miniature hand warmers into small mittens with an easy, practiced grace. Another knelt to Lily's eye level and smiled without words. Safety had a texture, and the room was starting to feel it. Mark and Claire shared a brief nod, tactical things unspooling in that glance. Perimeter transfer, evidence hold, warrants layered onto what they'd seen. But under it lived the same simple directive. This convoy gets to the station smooth. "Route 2, Claire said, already moving toward the door. "Plows cleared it." "Copy." Mark turned to Noah. "You're with me and Shadow." Noah swallowed, then nodded. He didn't let go of the collar. The team staged the exit like a puzzle you solved without forcing any piece. First vehicle, a medic and 2 children, heat high, seatbelts double-checked. Second, Mark, Shadow, Noah, Daisy, and the oldest boy. Claire took the third with the remaining medic. The detained man, silent now, was handed to an outer unit already waiting beyond the pines, away from the children's sightline. They stepped outside. The day had softened into a pale gold that brushed the treetops. Snow whispered under boots. The forest giving back its usual sounds now that the urgent ones were done. No engines revved hard. They hummed. Before climbing in, Noah crouched without a word and pressed his forehead to Shadow's for a heartbeat. The way kids do when they've learned that trust can be a place to rest. Shadow blinked slow, then hopped into the back, settling in a way that made space for everyone. In the cruiser, Mark adjusted the mirror. Noah met his eyes there just for a breath, then looked down at Shadow's paw, which had conveniently found its way onto the boy's shoe like a paperweight holding a page open. Noah's hand laid over it. The smallest shake in his fingers eased. They rolled out in a staggered line, tires whispering across the plowed path, pines sliding away like curtains. Through the windshield, the road opened in a clean ribbon of white and asphalt. Simple, honest, leading toward heat and light and names that would be spoken out loud. Half a mile out, the radio clicked. "Subject secured. Transport initiated." Claire's voice, balanced, certain. "Copy," Mark said. He didn't add anything. He didn't need to. The work now was steady work, checks, calls, doors opening at the station, and hands reaching with cocoa and soft towels. Noah tightened his hold once more on Shadow's collar as the cruiser eased around a bend. Not fear, confirmation. The kind you give yourself to make sure the good thing is still there. "It is," Mark said, answering the question the boy hadn't spoken. "He's right here." Shadow's ear flicked, as if agreeing. The dog leaned into Noah's knee, and together they watched the forest fall behind them. The last of the cabin's darkness shrinking to a dot in the mirror, replaced by the quiet brightness of a winter road that finally led home. By late afternoon, the station had the feel of a church after a storm. Quiet, warm, lit from inside. The medbay hummed. Coats steamed on a rack by the radiator. Someone brewed fresh cocoa that smelled like a promise. Mark stood near the hallway phone, a paper cup cooling in his hand. Shadow sprawled with his chin on Noah's sneaker. The boy's fingers rested in the dog's rough, idle, anchored, the way you hold a railing on a moving train. Dispatch slid a note across the counter. "Lynn Holloway is on line 3. Below it, one more word, underlined twice. Family." Mark pressed the button, eyes still on Noah. "This is Mark," he said, steady, low. A woman's voice arrived thin with distance but firm at the edges. "I'm Lynn," a small breath. "Evan's aunt." Mark let the name settle. The room seemed to shift by a degree, chairs, walls, even the hum of the soda machine listening closer. He glanced toward Claire at the far desk. She paused, pen hovering above her notes. Lynn continued, words careful, measured, built like a bridge over swift water. "My mother, Margaret." She never stopped, a soft exhale. Never. Flyers, phone calls, little candles on windowsills every December. School pictures lined up across years that did not include him. Lists of tips, all the false ones crossed out with a hand that shook and then didn't. 7 winters and the same front porch light left on like a lighthouse. Mark felt gravity pull at the center of his chest. He pictured the yellow house Noah had whispered about, a warm smell that memory had kept alive when other things went dim. He pictured an older woman counting nights the way you count stitches, refusing to drop the thread. Across the room, Noah sat on the bench like a person trying not to take up space. Lily slept under a quilt with a crocheted edge some volunteer had left in a bin years ago. Daisy perched close, palms around a paper cup, absorbing heat through cardboard. The oldest boy studied the vending machine's swirl of lights as if learning a new constellation. Everything quiet. Everything watching. "Lynn," Mark said, keeping his voice in the safe middle. "We have a boy who matches your nephew's age and missing year photo. He looked at Noah's hand still in Shadow's fur. "He's safe." Silence. Not empty, full. Then, "Is Mom there yet?" The question broke and mended in the same breath. "Not yet," Mark said. "We'll bring her in with care." Lynn's words came slower, softer, like she was placing them on a table one at a time. Tell him Margaret kept the porch light on. Tell him the dogwood bloomed late this spring and she took it as a sign. Tell him if he wants to hear it." Mark didn't promise. He set the receiver down gently and let the room breathe. The station clock ticked. Snowmelt pattered in the gutter. A radiator knocked once, settling into its own idea of warmth. He walked to the bench and crouched. Shadow's ears lifted, but he didn't move otherwise, a good sentinel pretending to nap. Noah glanced at Mark, then at the phone on the wall, then back to Shadow, his triangle of safety. "Your aunt called," Mark said, calm. "Your grandmother never stopped looking. Never." He watched the words touch Noah's face and change it. Small muscles near the eyes, a near-invisible catch in the throat. No theatrics. Relief often arrives like a quiet room after a loud one. Noah's gaze drifted to the window, where the world was turning a gentle blue. His hand tightened in Shadow's fur. The German shepherd's tail gave a single, measured thump, as if to mark the moment on an invisible calendar. Across the hall, Claire updated the board. Names filling lines that had been question marks this morning. She glanced over, caught Mark's eye, and in that look threaded 2 truths together. This is the boy, and this part of the story turns on love that refused to dim. The station softened around them. An officer set 2 muffins on a napkin near Daisy. No words, just the small ceremony of placing food where it would be found. A medic kneeled to retape a corner of Lily's blanket, hands unhurried, as if time could be taught to move kindly. Mark sat on the bench's edge, shoulder to shoulder with Noah, not crowding. He let the lesson open itself rather than lecturing it into the air. Persistence is not loud, he thought. It's the porch light left on, and the phone number never changed. It's a boy learning to be still next to a dog, until breath finds its path again. It's a grandmother keeping the shape of a name where it belongs, even when silence tries to sand it down. In the reflective glass of the window, Mark caught his own outline and, behind it, another room, the pediatric floor where Mia dozed between bloodwork and cartoons. He thought of hospital halls traced at midnight, of tiny victories measured in milliliters and minutes. He understood, bone deep, that endurance isn't the absence of pain. It's moving through it without letting it tell you who you are. Claire approached, file in hand, voice pitched to that same safe middle. Lynn is bringing Margaret at first light, comma. We'll stage a quiet room. Then softer, for Mark alone, you were right to keep the pace slow. He nodded. Pace is a language children read better than adults. Too fast is a shout, steady is a welcome. Noah's fingers began a small rhythm in Shadow's coat, a silent Morse that meant, I'm here. You're here. Okay. The dog's eyes half closed, absorbing the message and sending one back with breath and weight. Loyalty lives in that loop, not in grand gestures, but in shared air and the agreement to stay. If this story had to teach anything, Mark knew it now. Bonds survive not because hurt never happened, but because something, someone, refused to let hurt be the last editor. Margaret's long winter of phone calls, Lynn's careful sentences, a K9 pressing warmth into a boy's chilled hands. These are the stubborn threads. Pull them together and you get a net strong enough to lift. He stood and crossed to the whiteboard where yesterday's map still hung. Noah's River Bend, the words only wind. He capped the marker, paused, and wrote one new word in a neat hand near the corner. Home. Not circled, not underlined. Just present, like a door left open. Behind him, Daisy laughed once, small, surprised, at something the vending machine did when she pressed two buttons at the same time. The oldest boy smiled the quiet kind of smile you share only with the floor. Lily breathed evenly, a sound like a seashell held to the ear. Shadow sighed, a soft whistle exhale dogs make when they've decided the room can rest. Mark looked back at Noah. The boy's chin had tipped toward his chest, eyes heavy but wakeful. He was listening, to the radiator, to Lily's even breath, to the muffled shuffle of officers trading shifts, to the idea that a name might find him again. Tomorrow, Mark said, comma steady. Morning. Noah nodded, once. Not a leap, a step. The first light would bring a woman who had memorized his face from photographs and kept her porch light on for 7 winters. The first light would carry a name across a small space and set it down with care. Outside, snow eased off the roof in soft slides. The sky held that deepening color that makes you whisper without knowing why. Inside, persistence took its true shape. Not a march, a keeping. And in the quiet, with Shadow's breath rolling like tide against his sneaker, Noah let that keeping hold him, while the station and the town and all its good people kept the light on. Dawn arrived like a careful hand pulling back a curtain. Frost silvered the steps of the station, and the street beyond held its breath. Inside, lights hummed low, coffee steamed on a windowsill, and the radiator ticked a slow metronome. Shadow lay near the lobby door, chin on his paws, watching the glass as if it were a horizon. A car eased to the curb, the engine quieted. 2 silhouettes sat still for a beat. Then the passenger door opened. A woman stepped out, small, bundled, upright in a way that said the years had tried to bend her and she'd said no. Margaret. Behind her, Lynn came around the hood, eyes bright with wakefulness that had nothing to do with sleep. Mark met them halfway. No rush, no announcements. The door sighed open and the warmth slid out to greet them. Margaret paused on the threshold and looked around, not like a visitor, but like someone recognizing a place from a dream. Benches, bulletin board, a potted plant with a brave leaf, the quiet hum that stations get before the day names itself. In the far corner, Noah rose from the end of a couch where he'd been sitting with Lily tucked against a pillow, and Daisy hovering like a small moon. He didn't move forward. Not yet. His eyes found the woman in the doorway and stayed there, gathering detail as if he'd been waiting his whole life to map this face. Margaret's breath hitched, just the smallest of stumbles, and then she steadied. She didn't call out. She didn't hurry. She set her palm on the counter, as if grounding herself, and took 3 measured steps. Lynn hovered a pace behind, hands fisted in her coat pockets, holding herself together so the moment could belong to them. Noah's shoulders lifted in a breath that came late. He glanced once at Shadow, a question formed without sound. Shadow answered by standing and touching his nose to the boy's wrist. A gate opening. They met at the center of the room like 2 lines that had been running parallel, finally turning toward each other. There were no speeches, only the soft collapse of distance. Margaret reached up and rested both hands on either side of Noah's face, thumbs light as if she were afraid to press away a miracle. The boy closed his eyes for a heartbeat and opened them again, and the room learned a new definition of quiet. She said, the word too full to land. Noah's mouth moved once, twice, then settled into a small shape that could hold a name. Lynn stepped in when the air allowed, one hand on Margaret's shoulder, the other hovering near Noah's sleeve, not gripping, just present. She murmured a few words, gentle commas, not periods, and the 3 of them folded into a kind of embrace that kept space for breath and the future. Shadow sat, guarding the perimeter of joy the way he'd guarded everything else. Daisy watched with the solemn focus of a child who understands ceremonies. Lily stirred, rubbed her eyes, and smiled at the shape the morning had taken. The oldest boy exhaled a long-held note and let his gaze go soft. The rest of the day unfurled like a clean sheet. Interviews became conversations. Files became stories with people in them. Names found their places. Mark kept pace, never pushing, letting each step declare itself before taking the next. Claire moved between rooms with her notebook and her steadiness, answering the calls that followed a door finally opening. Justice worked in the background, steady gears turning, papers drafted, evidence transferred with gloved hands and clear signatures. The man from the cabin faced charges that did not need embellishment. In the weeks that followed, courtrooms filled with measured voices and careful questions, and the verdict arrived like a bell rung once and heard everywhere. Life without parole, no spectacle, no lingering, just the firm public answer to a harm the community refused to let remain nameless. The investigation widened. Tips gave way to maps, and maps gave way to doors. With warrants signed and teams briefed, quiet raids moved at dawn across counties. Outbuildings checked, basements opened, hidden rooms turned into sunlit spaces. More children stepped into fresh air. More blankets found shoulders. More names were spoken out loud and written down in the right places. The town, and then towns beyond, learned what courage looks like when it's shared. A dispatcher holding a line open, a neighbor reporting a pattern, an agent reading a rumor like a compass, a K9 finding the exact place where the floor gives way. In Evergreen, the station changed. Not in furniture or paint, but in the weather of the place. People entered and lowered their voices, not out of fear, but respect. Margaret came by with a tin of cookies and set them on the counter with a nod, then sat in the lobby with a book and a look of someone finally allowed to read the easy chapters. Lynn learned the names of every medic on the rota and remembered them because memory was her art. Noah moved through the halls in a gentle orbit around Shadow, learning where the good echoes live and which doors are always open. Mark carried the day in his bones and then went home to Mia, where bedtime lived on a clock more honest than any schedule, stories told in soft tones, cartoons paused halfway through a laugh, a German shepherd careful as a moonbeam climbing onto the foot of a hospital bed so a small hand could find the right place to rest. He understood that closure isn't a door slamming. It's a series of windows opening to let the room breathe. Late afternoon, the lobby caught a golden angle of sun. Daisy stood near the vending machine, frowning at a button that always surprised her. Mark approached with Shadow's scuffed tennis ball, quiet as an invitation, and placed it in her palm. She weighed it like an artifact, turned it, then looked up at him for permission. He lifted his chin toward the hallway. They went to the back lot where the plows had left a clean oval of packed snow. Daisy bent, arm back, and let the ball go. It bounced once and skittered. Shadow gave it a thoughtful beat, then trotted after with a deliberate gait that kept her in the game. He nosed it back, not too hard, a perfect pass. Daisy laughed, clear, surprised, unguarded, the kind of sound that reshapes the air around it. Officers at the far door paused and smiled without speaking. The oldest boy, watching from the stoop, let the smile reach his eyes. 3 throws, then 4, then 5. Each return widened the circle around them. Lily clapping from the bench, Noah standing with one hand on the rail and the other on Shadow's collar when the dog passed. Margaret at the window with a hand to her mouth, because some sounds are prayers answered, whether or not you meant them that way. Claire stepped out and leaned against the doorframe, pen idle for once. "Good sound," she said, a small line of warmth in her voice. "Best one," Mark answered. The lesson lived there in the snow, simple as breath. Darkness doesn't lift because one person flips a switch. It lifts because many hands find many lamps and decide together to keep them lit. It looks like a boy naming himself without fear. It looks like a grandmother who kept a porch light on through 7 winters. It looks like neighbors dialing and officers listening, and a team walking slow into the trees. It looks like a dog returning a yellow ball again and again, until a child remembers how laughter feels in her chest. Evening moved in with long shadows and soft edges. The ball's scuffs caught the last light and turned it into a stripe. Daisy's breath made brief clouds that vanished as fast as they formed. Shadow's tail wrote a calm story on the air. When the cold finally reached small fingers, Mark tucked the ball into Daisy's coat pocket and tapped the outline once, a promise that the game could continue tomorrow. She nodded, solemn first, then smiling, and followed the others inside. The door closed on the gentle thud of boots and the hush of a place choosing to be kind. Justice had done its work, and so had love. And in the weave between them, hope started taking root. Quiet, stubborn, exactly the right size to grow. The hospital at night had its own weather. Hushed, warm, held together by soft beeps and the rubber hush of shoes on waxed floors. Mark signed in with a nod the nurses had learned, the kind that said he'd keep the room gentle and leave it better than he found it. Shadow walked at heel, steps slow, nails whispering on tile, a practiced gentleman in a service vest. Mia slept curled toward the window, moonlight pooling on her blanket like spilled milk. The IV pump clicked a polite metronome. A paper snowflake someone had taped to the cabinet edge fluttered with the vent's breath. Mark stood a moment and let the sight steady him. He'd been holding other people's storms all day. Here he set them down. He asked with his eyes. The nurse answered with hers. Okay. Shadow hopped onto the bed the way he always did. Careful as a roomer, weight distributed, paws placed like puzzle pieces. He settled along Mia's legs and rested his chin near her knees. A small hand found his head without waking, fingertips working down the length of his ear in a rhythm she must have learned in sleep. Shadow's tail gave one quiet, grateful thump, or Mark pulled a chair closer and watched the exchange. Girl, dog, shared air. He let the minutes lengthen. Every so often, Mia would breathe a little deeper and Shadow would match it, as if the two of them had found a wavelength and decided to travel it together. Out the window, the night sky looked like clean slate. He thought about the day, the porch light story returning to a porch, a room at the station that had felt like a hearth, the way Daisy's laugh had cut through the hallway and rearranged the atoms there. He thought about Margaret's hands cupping Noah's face and a life sentence spoken in a courtroom, and the soft, ordinary heroism of everyone who had chosen to pick up a corner of the problem and carry it. He also thought about the spaces between those moments, the pauses, the patience, the decisions to go slow and keep the temperature kind. That was the work, too. Maybe the most important part. Mia's eyelids fluttered open, the blue of her eyes reflecting the monitor's pale green. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Her hand flexed once in Shadow's fur, and then she closed her eyes again, the kind of trust that is simple and absolute. Mark brushed her hair off her forehead, a motion he'd made 10,000 times, a promise written in muscle memory. When she slept deeper, he stood, tugged the blanket up 1 inch, and kissed the air above her temple, as if sound itself could be a comfort. The nurse smiled from the doorway, tiny, private, and returned to her chart. Shadow slid off the bed as gently as he'd climbed on, shook once and looked up for the next thing. They stepped out into the late hour, the parking lot glazed with thin ice that sparkled like sifted salt. Evergreen sky was clear as glass. Stars hung low, old company. Their breath came white and then vanished. The world had that winter quiet where even a zipper sounds too loud. Mark put his hands in his coat pockets and walked without a destination. Just a loop around the block to let the day unwind. Shadow kept pace at his left, steady as a shoulder. 2 houses away, wind chimes answered the breeze with a tune that didn't try to be pretty. He found the unevenness comforting. He turned down Main where the shop windows held their soft displays, wool scarves like friendly clouds, a stack of red lunch pails, a hand-lettered sign that read, "Open tomorrow." In one window, children's boots stood in a neat row, tiny circles of salt marking where they'd once rested on real floors. He pictured Daisy's boots there someday, scuffed from play, a scrawl of permanent marker on the heel. He pictured Noah tracing the edges of a map that led to baseball diamonds and library cards, and a dog who always found the ball. At the corner, he stopped and let the truth of the night land. Some stories end with doors closing, but the good ones end with doors open and lights left on. Justice had been named. Love had not looked away. The rest would take time, appointments, paperwork, tears that arrive on Tuesdays for no reason, laughter that sneaks in on Thursdays because somebody burned the toast. That was okay. Time is a tool when people choose to use it gently. Shadow's breath plumed steadily. He lifted his head and looked at Mark, the kind of look that seems to ask a question and answer it at the same time. "Yeah," Mark said, a half smile in the dark. "You did good." They stood there a minute longer, listening. Somewhere far off, a train shouldered through the valley, its horn stretched thin by distance. Closer, A porch light blinked on, then off, then on again as someone tested the bulb. Mark thought of Margaret, how a simple habit can become a faith. He hoped she slept for 12 straight hours. He hoped Lynn dreamed about beaches. He hoped Daisy woke up hungry, a good sign. He hoped Noah chose a new word for the corner of his drawing where only wind used to live. Maybe home. Maybe here. He and Shadow turned toward the station. Not because there was work to do. Papers had been signed, kids tucked in. But because sometimes you return to a place to practice leaving it without worry. The lot was quiet. The soda machine hummed its lonely hymn. Inside, the late crew carried mugs and kept the volume down and moved like people who understood that peace is something you tend, not something you set and forget. Mark paused by the whiteboard. No one had erased the river bend or the trees. A small square of space had been left around the word he'd written, home, like it was fragile and needed room to grow. He added nothing. It was enough. In the lobby, he crouched by Shadow and rested his forehead to the dogs for a second, the same way he'd seen Noah do. Sometimes the smallest voice changes everything, he said, almost to the room. And sometimes the one who hears it walks on 4 legs. Shadow blinked slow. Agreement. Now to you, who found this story in a late hour or a busy afternoon, who listened all the way to this quiet corner, carry this with you. Kindness is not a soft thing. It is a strong thing used softly. Keep your porch light on, in whatever way you can. Pay attention to the wind when it sounds like a child learning how to speak up. Believe the little clues. Share the heavy stuff. If a dog offers you a tennis ball, throw it back. If this story found you at the right time, let me know. Tell me about the small moment when compassion changed a path in your life, yours or someone else's. Leave it in the comments so another late-night traveler can find it and feel a little less alone. And if you want more stories where people and animals pull each other toward the light, tap like, hit subscribe, and keep the bell on so you'll know when the next porch light flickers on. Under a sky full of old stars, in a town that learned how to hold its breath and then let it go, a boy slept with a dog at his feet. A grandmother exhaled 7 winters, and an officer walked home slower than usual, grateful for the sound of 4 paws on cold pavement keeping time beside him.